It looks like our participation has leveled off, so we're going to go ahead and get started and let everyone continue to join. Good afternoon. I'm Hallie Zimmers with the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. We're pleased to have you here with us again today as part of African Swine Fever Action Week. Today, we're focused on what to expect in an ASF outbreak. And before I turn it over to Dr. Jack Shear, our Associate Administrator, I do want to mention just a couple of logistical items here as we get started. First, you may have heard we are recording this webinar and we do plan to post it on our website. We have already posted the recordings from the previous 3 ASF Action Week webinars that we've held already, and those are available. You can Google ASF Action Week and the webinar link will come up, and we'll also put the direct link to those webinars in the chat if you weren't able to join us and are interested in what was discussed already. Today's webinar does build on those conversations. In addition, we are planning on having a Q&A session after our presenters provide their updates. And I want to bring your attention to the bottom of your Zoom screen. There is a Q&A tab there, and that's where I want to encourage you to put your questions in. That is the easiest place for us to track the questions as they're coming in. And feel free to type your questions as you think about them. And as folks are presenting, if you think of something, go ahead and add it to the chat, and we'll have that archived there as we jump into the Q&A once everyone has finished speaking. There is a chat tab. If you've got a technical question or you're having IT issues, you can feel free to chat our panelists there, and we will do our best to assist you. I think those are the main things I wanted to mention. I'll remind everyone about the Q&A as after our presenters finish speaking. But I think with that, we are ready to go, and I will turn things over to Dr. Jack Shear, our Associate Administrator. Thank you.
Thank you, Hallie. And first of all, I apologize I can't get my video to work, but you don't need to see me anyway, so it's just as well. I wanted to say hello to everyone and thank you all for being here today. This is day 4 of our series of webinars that we're calling the ASF Action Week. The topic for today's webinar is what to expect in an ASF outbreak. While this is something that we're working hard to prevent and we hope never happens, we also need to be prepared and want you to be prepared as well. If we do get ASF in the United States, it will at least initially have a significant impact on our day-to-day operations in regards to swine. The extent of those changes and how long they will last will depend on a number of factors. Every outbreak is unique in terms of size, scale, and impact. One thing we know for certain is that the earlier we detect the disease and the better our biosecurity practices, the smaller the outbreak. Today, we want to talk about steps APHIS will immediately take to combat ASF should we confirm a detection in the United States. Next slide, please. First, the Secretary would likely take necessary steps to declare an extraordinary emergency. APHIS would lead a coordinated national approach for control and eradication and ensure the funding and resources necessary for the response. APHIS would also likely issue a national standstill for at least 72 hours to prohibit all movement of swine. This would increase our ability to stop the disease spread and to act quickly to restore movement on a regional basis. Producers would also need to implement elevated biosecurity protocols to protect their herds. USDA would also work to find out where ASF is and determine next steps. That would involve tracing of all associated movements of infected pigs, or what we call contact tracing. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to briefly introduce today's speakers. They will provide more context about what you might expect if we had an ASF detection in the United States. Our first speaker is Dr. Rosemary Sifford. She's the Deputy Administrator of our Veterinary Services Program, and she'll go over our ASF response plan in greater detail. After Dr. Sifford, Dr. Jeffrey Kaizen will be speaking. He's the State Veterinarian for the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, and he'll cover contact tracing from ASF positive premises. Finally, Dr. Beth Thompson, who is the State Veterinarian for Minnesota's Board of Animal Health, will be speaking on the important lessons learned as a result of the 2014-2015 avian influenza or high-path AI outbreak, including things producers wish they had known beforehand. Again, thank you all again for joining us. I look forward to a productive session. Hallie, back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Scheer. We're going to give Dr. Sifford a moment to pull up her presentation and start sharing, and then we will jump right in.
Oh, is it in presentation mode now?
It is. I can see it. You're good to go.
Excellent. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you this afternoon. It sounds like for those who've been able to join all week this week, there's been a lot of really good discussion, and I hope that we continue that this afternoon. Some of the things that I'll talk about this afternoon will just build on, as Hallie said earlier, some of the things that you've talked about earlier this week. So first, just a little bit more about African swine fever, the virus that is the center of all the talks this week. It is a viral disease that can spread quickly among pigs, and it is usually fatal. Most pigs that contract the virus will die. One of the reasons that we're so concerned is that we do not have any effective treatments or vaccines at this time, and that means that our options for getting rid of the virus are very limited. And our focus is usually on eradication. An outbreak in the United States would have devastating economic impact in the swine industry. And so we want to be very certain to make it clear that it's not because this disease affects humans or is a food safety concern or any of that that causes us to have the high level of concern that we have. It's really about the impact that it would have on the swine industry. It would have a really significant impact. It would likely infect a large number of animals, and as I mentioned, most of them would have fatal infections. Some additional key facts about ASF that you may have heard already this week. It does move primarily via direct contact between infected pigs and can move through indirect contact with the virus. And that can be from bodily fluids that are moved from one animal to another, contaminated equipment, vehicles, or people. Or one of the ways that we anecdotally hear is a real challenge or contaminated product. So a product that is contaminated with the virus and somehow makes its way back into a swine herd and is consumed by a pig. Anecdotally, that is the reason that we've heard in a few cases of spread of the disease. And so one of the reasons that we encourage everyone to be very careful with any movement. And finally, it can be spread by soft tick vectors that bite an infected pig and then bite a non-infected pig. The soft tick vector can harbor the virus for an extended period of time, and in countries where the most appropriate species of soft ticks occur, that is a very common method of spread. So what are the clinical signs of African swine fever? That's another one of the things that makes this disease a real challenge. It's not a disease that has a lot of pathognomonic signs. So it's not a disease that you can very easily look at an animal and say those signs mean that it has African swine fever and nothing else. The clinical signs can look like a lot of other diseases, and that makes it really challenging. It's also one of the reasons that we really encourage the submission for foreign animal disease diagnostics when you see any kind of clinical sign that could be consistent with African swine fever, so that we can make sure we are properly ruling out these really dangerous diseases and not just assuming that these clinical signs are associated with a much more mild disease. So there's a lot of things that could be included: weakness, coughing, red or dark coloration on the skin around the ears, and some blood clots under the skin. Like I said, a lot of these signs can be confused with other diseases. That's the real reason that we really encourage foreign animal disease diagnostic investigations if you have a pig that you have questions or concerns about. And the reason that we really want that to happen is because we want early detection. Early detection is what will help us to be sure that we don't allow the disease to spread in a way that might cause us more damage to the overall swine herd. And so the sooner we identify these sick pigs and are able to stop the spread of the disease, the better. I'm sure you've talked a good bit this week about keeping African swine fever out of the United States. Certainly a lot of work goes into keeping African swine fever out of the United States. We do a lot of work to prevent introduction, involving a lot of our partners with the federal government. We work very closely with Customs and Border Protection to help them with enforcing the regulations for restrictions on animals and animal products from countries that are affected with the ASF. We also work with producers in the United States to encourage good biosecurity. And good biosecurity is one of the primary ways that a producer can help fend off the introduction of ASF. Good biosecurity plan can help in a lot of other ways as well, and it's really important for just about any disease and helping to make sure it doesn't get into your facility. I couldn't say and stress enough how important a really good biosecurity plan is. And one of the reasons that we want people to have a good plan in place before we have a detection is because we want it to be practiced and have you be very comfortable with it in the case that there is a detection, so that you don't have to worry about whether you're doing a good job with your biosecurity. And biosecurity is what might protect you if there is a detection in the United States and keep you from bringing the disease to your herd. So it's better to have a good plan in place early and be ready and be very well practiced on it. So one of the reasons that we're, very concerned, as I mentioned before, would be the impact on the swine of the United States. And one of the reasons that that's important to us is because a significant percentage of pork produced in the United States is exported from the United States. And in the case of an African swine fever outbreak, it is very likely that we would have trade losses, at least initially. Until you can identify where the disease is and get it under control, there'd be a good chance that a lot of trading partners would initially cut off all trade until we could identify the ways that we have control measures in place, and then there might be limited trade available to us in areas that are not affected. Because of these export losses, it is likely that hog prices would decrease. There'd be animals that wouldn't have a place to go right away. So it's really important, again, that we try to use all the tools available to us to keep African swine fever out of the United States. And as Dr. Scheer mentioned earlier, and we'll go into more detail now, the things that we would do right away would be most likely declaring an extraordinary emergency and putting in place a movement standstill. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next few slides. As Dr. Scheer mentioned, we would want to move right away to start taking actions to control and contain any disease as soon as we identify the first case. And as I mentioned earlier, we want to identify that first case as soon as possible so that we can prevent spread. So one of the first actions might be a declaration of an extraordinary emergency. The declaration would allow us to more easily partner with our state partners to be able to put resources toward any kind of control measures that might need to be put into place. It also helps us access funding more easily and quickly that might be needed to help with any purchases that we might need to make for equipment or for purchasing sick animals. We'd also very likely put in place a 72-hour national movement standstill. The movement standstill would give us a good opportunity to understand exactly where the disease is and be able to put control measures in place before animals were moving again. In the case of the movement standstill, any animals or germplasm that were already in transit would be allowed to go to their destination, but no new movements would be allowed until the national movement standstill was released. And then once it is released, there would likely be control movements in certain areas, particularly around the area of infection. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. During the time of the national movement standstill, we'd be working to identify exactly where the disease is located and how we could best control it. That would involve additional surveillance and testing of animals in any areas that we think might have been affected. So again, in that 72-hour standstill period, that very first time after we find that initial infection, one of the things that would be really important for producers would be watching the swine herds for signs of disease and making sure that you have your biosecurity in its best shape ever. And so again, when you're watching for signs of disease in this case, they're not going to be very clear signs that it must be classical swine fever or African swine fever and couldn't be anything else. And so if you saw any sign of illness, it'd be really important to get in touch with your veterinarian right away or talk to your state animal health official and try to get a good diagnosis so we could be very certain about where we have disease and where we don't have disease. And we'd be working very closely with the states to provide updates to producers through public announcements, through websites, and maybe even other streams of communication that you might have in place with your states already. One of the things that we've talked about a few times during the National Movement Standstill would be that processing plants would obviously have the order of their shipments coming in disrupted. And that means they would have to reestablish their schedules, and that could cause some additional disruptions in the schedules. So it's important to note that even when the 72-hour standstill is over, again, as I said before, there'd be certain areas where there might be still controlled movements based on the disease status. And then, of course, even in areas where there are not controlled movements based on disease status, there still could be some need for changes in scheduling and shipments to get to processing plants and things like that that had disrupted schedules. The response would be a joint federal and state response working very closely with all the involved producers. We would work as quickly as possible to identify where African swine fever exists or where we suspect that it exists. As I mentioned before, putting in place some very rapid additional surveillance measures. And then based on those measures, making determinations about where we need to continue movement restrictions or quarantines, and where we're able to allow animals to move more freely again. If your herd is associated with a company that has a positive African swine fever finding, it could be that you would be quarantined even if your herd itself has not tested positive yet. And this is because one of the things that we know is that we would not necessarily be able to have a positive test immediately upon exposure. And if it looks like you might have had an exposure through some movement between your herd and a positive herd, we'd need time to do enough testing to ensure that your herd is not positive before we'd be able to allow movement. Another thing that you need to be aware of is that even if your herd does continue to test negative and appears healthy, if you're in a control area, which I'll talk more about in just a minute, there could be additional monitoring and maybe permitted movement, because control areas are areas in which we want to be very certain about the disease status before animals move. So just a little bit more about control areas. In this slide, you can see the X denotes in the center denotes the potentially infected herd. And then the pink zone is the infected zone. So that is based on a certain radius around an infected herd or maybe a few infected herds. And then the blue is the buffer zone, which is basically a zone that has some enhanced surveillance to allow us to have a buffer between the infected zone and then the zones that are considered a part of the free zone, which might be where there is some additional surveillance in that tan-colored zone, and then outside that, the other free areas where maybe not even any additional surveillance is needed beyond the standard surveillance. These zones are zones that we routinely establish in the event of a disease outbreak to help manage the surveillance and help manage the movements of animals. It helps us to establish the animals that are at highest risk and focus our energies and resources on those animals and making sure we are finding the disease where it's necessary. And then it also allows us to give more ability for those who are out in the free areas or in a surveillance zone that might not need to be stopped from movement, but perhaps we could allow movements in those areas. The control zone is comprised of the infected zone and the buffer zone. The control zone Could be any shape or size. It really just depends on the size of the outbreak. Could be as small as 5 kilometers in radius, or it could be very large if there are several herds infected that are spread out over a distance, but they're in a similar area where they overlap with each other. We would look at the information that we have from testing to establish these zones, and then once we have the zones established, that would dictate the response efforts and the level of surveillance and the important things that you might have to do to have movement. So whether a movement would require a permit or not. If your facility gets African swine fever, it would be quarantined by your state animal health official. We would work very closely with you to make sure you had a complete herd inventory. It's important to have a complete herd inventory before any animals are removed or anything changes, so that we can properly reimburse you for any animals that we do approve to be destroyed to help control disease spread. And so we would be talking with you, making sure that we had that inventory and had it as accurate as possible before any animals were moved or destroyed. It's really important to have that in place. That's what allows us to work with you on an indemnity payment. The incident management team would also work to depopulate the swine and help dispose of the carcasses. They would work with all the owners and growers involved to set up a plan that would be appropriate for the area, appropriate for the size and the number of animals to be depopulated, and then a disposal plan that would meet environmental requirements in the area. And we'd also be working very closely with our state partners, and that would involve as well their environmental agencies in addition to the animal health agencies. After the animals are removed, we would work closely with you to determine the best method to clean and disinfect the facility. The methods can vary based on the type of facility or what's available to most quickly clean and disinfect. We would work with you on that, put that plan together. And then once the facility is cleaned and disinfected and has had some time to make sure that the cleaning and disinfection has worked properly, we could work with you on a restocking plan. And the time that might elapse there could depend on what's going on in your area as well with other farms. If we're still having an active outbreak, it'd be very difficult for us to start with restocking plans. And so all of that we'd be working closely with you and with state partners to make sure that every piece of that comes together clearly. So while we don't want to have to experience African swine fever in the United States, and we're all working very hard to make sure that we don't experience African swine fever in the United States, we do want to be clear on what would happen and how we need to prepare for that so that we do have the information needed in the event of an outbreak. Appreciate again the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon, and I will turn it back to Hallie. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Sifford. Since we spoke about state partners, or since Dr. Sifford just spoke about state partners, we are going to turn to one of those partners now, Dr. Kaizen. He's going to talk about movements within a control zone. I can see your presentation, Dr. Kaizen.
Sure. Can you hear me then too?
Yes.
Thank you. So I'd first again like to thank USDA for organizing, presenting, and facilitating ASF Action Week. I would appreciate the opportunity to present today on some issues that are difficult but important to discuss. You know, one of the things in putting together a brief presentation and tying a lot of things together, it's not easy to do that, and a lot of these topics this week relate to other topics. I think Dr. Johnson did a great job yesterday presenting biosecurity, what it means and what we need to do, and how that involves, and when we talk about contact tracing here. So he helped to set the stage for what some of the things I'm going to talk today about. Modern agriculture saw some major changes that occurred in the 1980s. Those changes involved becoming very efficient and being able to provide an affordable and safe food supply system. One of the other things that happened at that time was agriculture became very linked, networked in many ways. So again, using the castle yesterday, picture a drawbridge on a castle going up and down many times during the day. And every time that drawbridge goes up and down, it's vulnerable to disease entry. So that helped very much set the stage. Maybe to also help tie things together and lay a little groundwork here, Iowa pig statistics. Everybody knows we have a lot of pig farms in Iowa. Iowa markets roughly every year 48 million hogs. At any one time, there's 24 million pigs raised in Iowa. And on average, our import numbers range from 29 to 33 million head per year. Some of the top states that import pigs into Iowa are Illinois, Missouri, Nebraska, Minnesota, and Oklahoma. We get a fair number of pigs also from Canada. And I'm stressing the importance here because those movements from other states, some of those movements originate from sow farms in other states. So these movements begin in other states, and it's an example of that networking. So the next thing I just want to briefly mention again, laying some more of the groundwork. You know, when a foreign animal disease happens, it becomes a regulatory disease. And certain things, Dr. Sifford did a great job laying the groundwork of the disease response and how it would go. The one thing I'll mention here is, you know, one of the things that we think about all the time during a foreign animal disease outbreak is we can't eliminate the industry while eliminating the disease. But we also can't let the disease eliminate the industry. And that interface is a fine line. And in fact, it can be very ugly at times. Some of our previous, you know, in 2015 during avian influenza, a couple of examples, you know, I set the stage there that how important industry is, what it means to Iowa, what the swine industry means to the United States. But there's people involved, there's people on farms. I can remember one of the very first farms that became infected in Iowa. It was a couple, they were contract growers, raised turkeys, and you know, it was very difficult for them when their flock became infected. You know, it was difficult to get people to come and help them. They felt like they were outcasts in the community. And in fact, you know, I met them at a fast food store in town because they needed a break to get off of the farm. The other thing that one of the vivid things that I will never forget from avian influenza was the time we were doing depopulation on a farm and the crew called from the farm and said, what do we do with the daughter's chickens that are in their basement? And we depopulated the whole site. So we take everything very seriously. Dr. Sifford mentioned regulatory authority. The 72-hour standstill, we're very supportive of that. She outlined the things that happen, how we draw the control area, what goes into that. So some of the things I want to talk about next are the quarantines, the contact tracing, and what goes into that. When we issue quarantines in Iowa, you know, we're going to issue a quarantine to all premises in the control area. We'll issue what we would call an affected quarantine, the infected premise, what triggers the control area. We'll also issue quarantines to all of the other premises in the control area. And, you know, we used to call those non-infected quarantines, but we're going to continue or start calling them not known to be infected quarantines. Because one of the things that we found in all of those contacts between premises, you know, we did have some of those non-infected premises that were in a control area become positive later on. One of the other things that we will do going forward is what's called network based controls, you know, and that's where we'll issue quarantines for premises that could be outside of the control area. And as was mentioned, when we're trying to find where disease is and where it's not, we have to be broad in where we go look for disease information to provide that the EPI, but we will issue quarantines for premises outside of the control area. And that was, one of the things we should have known it going into 2015, but it was a lesson we learned there that all of these connections, there could be disease elsewhere. And when we talk about the control area, one of the other things that we like to say instead of the free area, the non-control area, because we know disease is going to show up elsewhere based on these connections. And the network-based controls, looking at, it addresses the movements between swine sites, and that movement, relies in looking at all of that epi work to figure out, is it swine movements? Is it people movements? But we have to look elsewhere for all of those other premises. We won't set up control areas around other sites that we quarantine that are outside the control area if they're just network-based control quarantines or contact premises. But when we do find other infected premises, we will set up control areas around those. And so what becomes very difficult, and is described in even Dr. Johnson yesterday in talking about biosecurity and why it's so important, those connections, even maintenance trucks. But, there are so many connections that go far out from infected premises. We could talk about whether it's maintenance workers, whether it's load crews that load pigs in the middle of the night and travel several miles, 10 miles, 50 miles down the road to load pigs at another site. Whether it's, pigs moving to a packing plant from a site that is not known to be infected yet, or could have been infected when they went, and there's cross-contamination at a packing plant, and that trucker takes it back to another site. And maybe that site still has other pigs in it, and that site becomes infected before we know it, and even theoretically that site, if it is receiving wean pigs from a sow farm, and could track it back to a sow farm. But what I'm trying to point out is all of those connections and the work that we have to do with the contact tracing and trying to figure out where all of the other sites are. Dr. Sifford mentioned the 72-hour standstill, and our goal is to try and figure out what's going on, where disease is and where it's not in that 72 hours. But, some work we've done in the past year and analyzing some records. We've been very fortunate. Some people have shared records, various stakeholders in the industry. And when you start breaking that down, and some help that we've had working in EMERS and taking that information and showing where things overlap, we need everybody's help during that process. So some of the things that we'll do, we're going to look at the infected premise and work outward from that infected premise. But what we need help from everybody, veterinarians working with their producers, is when we issue these network-based control quarantines, some of those outer premises that are, you could say, are maybe distantly related or distant, don't have direct contacts, we need help in working through that, so we can start movements back up within those quarantines and premises that are not directly associated, but we need to show some information of how they're not directly related to that infected premise directly. So we all have to work together, and that's where keeping those good records, being able to provide them, being able to help us work through them as regulatory officials is going to be very critical. And you can see here some of the examples. The key ones we'll focus on is live animals, animal products, mortalities, and then some of those other connections. I mentioned in a prior discussion, swine record priorities of those records of any movements, having those for at least the last 30 days. We prioritized them. Some of the high priorities are those live animals, animal products, mortality, one of those network connections that, if a dead truck's going from site to site. I mentioned some of those other examples, and if you overlay some mortality pickups at a site and start overlaying the different networks. So hopefully everybody's kind of getting an understanding here that this is a hugely connected, networked, and we have to quickly work through a lot of those questions. So, you know, we understand that what that's all going to take, but it's going to be a Herculean task in that first 72 hours of what we need to do to get some of that information. So one of the things I want to end with is, you know, again, one of the key linchpins in all of this, well, premise ID, I can't forget to plug premise IDs and that critical piece of linchpin and connecting everything, but biosecurity is absolutely critical. Biosecurity is the protection from the unknowns. You can argue that it helps what to know and the knowns and setting up a biosecurity program, but biosecurity is the protection from the unknowns. And tying in with Dr. Johnson, if you think about this castle and the fortress around it, and if you think about being in those guard towers, and if you look out from those guard towers, what do you see on the outside? Are there arrows? Are there cannonballs? Is the enemy directly outside? Is ASF immediately directly outside your farm and waiting to get in? You know, if that's the case, just as Dr. Sifford mentioned, you need to be prepared ahead of time, because if that enemy is directly outside and you don't have that fortress solid, you're going to be at risk for getting disease. If you look out from that tower and you see the enemy coming over the hill, you know, is that disease entering the United States? Is it another state? I'd be thinking about, you know, is your biosecurity in place? Do you have time? You may or may not. If you look out over the horizon and you see bright blue skies and nothing's coming at you, are we doing a good job of keeping a foreign animal disease in a foreign country? But in any case, biosecurity is key. Having those records available, having them quickly accessible. So if something changes, we can quickly work through where disease is and where it's not. So thank you. I hope that was kind of a brief snapshot into where we would be at in Iowa and what our approaches would be to a regulatory response involved with African swine fever.
Thanks, Dr. Kaizen. We appreciate you joining us for the second time during African Swine Fever Action Week. And you touched on some of the impacts and challenges with the highly pathogenic avian influenza outbreak in 2015. And we also have Dr. Beth Thompson with us, state veterinarian in Minnesota, to talk in greater detail about aspects of an outbreak that producers wish they would have known ahead of time. And hopefully some of the information she imparts will help the swine producers with their preparations. So Dr. Thompson, over to you, and I'll give you the opportunity to share your screen.
Thank you. Good afternoon from the Midwest. Maybe good morning for some of the rest of us. See if I can get to. Can you see my screen?
Yes. It's not in presenter mode yet, but I can see your slides.
Yeah, let's get her there. And first of all, before I get going here, I do want to thank the Minnesota Turkey Growers Association, Dr. Michelle Crom, Dr. Greg Suskovic, and others taking us all back to 2015 and highly pathogenic avian influenza here in the state of Minnesota. Hindsight can be 20/20. And Minnesota, for those of you who aren't aware, Minnesota is the #1 turkey producing state. We also have a robust poultry production in other areas. And of course, we are good neighbors with Iowa geographically. And then we also are #2 in hogs. So very important agriculture in Minnesota, some very large industries. So again, hindsight's 20/20. Going back to 2015 and what was going on. Actually, late 2014, we had been watching what was going on the West Coast, and for some of those, hopefully there's some poultry producers also watching this, but for the swine production, veterinarians and everybody on the call, there had been some diagnosed cases of highly pathogenic avian influenza late 2014 on the West Coast. And folks here in Minnesota, you know, we were aware of what could occur. There are migratory pathways that birds follow, and we were, you know, a couple of pathways over, but we were certainly watching what was going on. So in Minnesota, we have what's called an EDMC, an Emergency Disease Management Committee, and we have that committee both in poultry and in swine. There are subcommittees of those larger committees, and it helps us, it brings together veterinarians, farmers, you know, related individuals, groups, everybody that's involved in those commodity groups to talk about current issues, about planning, about ideas. And that ongoing dialogue is really important for the farmers and vets, but also for regulators, as I sit as a state veterinarian, and everybody within the Board of Animal Health and responders. So I've got some data up here on the first screen about the 2015 event here in Minnesota. The first case was in March. Which means that the farmer and veterinarian actually saw clinical signs in the flock late February. So it's cold and it's still winter here in Minnesota in February. So it was, I'll just say, a bit of a surprise. The initial site was fairly isolated, and state regulators did the work with the farmer and the veterinarian with some USDA oversight in going into that site, of course, going through the process of depopulation and dealing with the carcasses and the ongoing cleaning process. But it was one site. You know, it was a fairly easy process. So since my presentation is about lessons learned, I guess the first lesson or maybe suggestion for everybody that's on this call, I think we all learned, don't ever assume that you're smarter than a virus. Because again, we thought that first one was pretty simple to deal with. As you can see from the information on the slide, eventually, through the next few months, we had 108 premises that were affected. And throughout the whole event here in Minnesota in 2015, 9 million birds were depopulated or died from that virus. So highly pathogenic avian influenza, HPAI, is a very different clinical picture, I think, than what we might see with African swine fever. And the pictures that I have up there on the slide right now show the same flock of birds 2 hours apart, okay? So on the left, you've got the turkeys up and they're around and they're looking healthy. They're out looking for water. They're out looking for food. And then just 2 hours later, and you can almost, you know, you can almost see how quiet they are, right? It's a very different clinical picture. Birds will die of AI sometimes within 48 to 72 hours. It's a very fast moving, and I'll say very obvious virus. So in Minnesota, samples for testing went to one of our 2 Nuln lab sites. We are very fortunate in Minnesota to have 2 sites for our veterinary diagnostic lab. But even then, you know, Minnesota is a really large state. It may take hours to get samples into a lab, to drive them in. So suggestion number 2 for everybody on this webinar, think about what may be needed for surveillance. And we realize that we're still hammering out what is going to be required for surveillance in certain parts of an outbreak or response. But certainly we can start working with the labs at at this point to figure out a schedule. So if you're 2 hours away from a lab to get samples in, it's a much different picture if you are 6 hours away. So what might be needed for testing and reporting, work with the labs and think about what can be done beforehand to get a schedule in place, or at least the bare bones of a schedule. And just for everybody here on the call, during avian influenza in Minnesota, we had couriers set up in different parts of the state that would bring samples in from the field to our diagnostic labs. A brief comment on process. I think this is something that everybody is aware of, but once you get into the process, it's something that, you know, the farmer and the veterinarian, they have to walk through this list. And I'm sure Dr. Shearer, if he's watching yet, and Dr. Zach, others from USDA, this is really bare bones a list of details that need to be taken care of. So starting at the top, you know, there's an indemnity process that needs to be gone through, paperwork. There are folks from USDA that need to be out on site and take a look at what's going on site and what animals are alive so that indemnity can be assigned. There's depopulation that needs to be done, combination again of the farmer, possibly the veterinarian, planning for depopulation. Composting or other carcass disposal, cleaning and disinfection, those are site-specific plans. The environmental sampling that goes on after the depopulation is done, and then of course repopulation. All of those are specific to the disease. They're also specific to the site. So suggestion number 3, have people available either on site or within your system who can be easily reached and can answer questions as they come up. Have that point person or maybe point people, you know, keep the numbers small. Those people might not have all of the answers when it comes to certain feed that was fed, certain trucking that came in. They might not have all the answers, but they know where to go to get them. And that helps out with the process if you winnow down the number of people that are involved in getting the paperwork and the processes taken care of. Some additional comments, farmer and veterinarian perspective on avian influenza. Make sure that your uninfected sites, or maybe I should say unaffected sites, are sufficiently staffed. So in addition to the work that's being done on the infected site, now that list that I had in the last screen, work still needs to be done on your disease-free sites. And Dr. Kaizen made this point, you know, really well. Biosecurity protocols, that biosecurity becomes so important when we have a foreign animal disease. You know, likewise on those uninfected sites, you need to make sure that folks are keeping up with their paperwork. Where are the hogs coming from? Where is the feed coming from? Are you still using rendering? All of that, because that paperwork might become very important in a few days or a few weeks if you unfortunately become part of a control area. The other thing too, internal and external communications, your staff are going to be asking questions and they will be talking amongst themselves. They're going to be talking to their neighbors. They're probably going to be asked questions within their community. So what is it you would like them to be talking about? Basic messages are easy to put together before an outbreak. You know, the one that rises to the top is pork is still safe to eat. So, you know, likewise, you know, the message with the external communications, that can be also crafted before a foreign animal disease actually makes its way into the United States. And then lastly, my last slide here, looking back on avian influenza, and I noticed this too within the Board of Animal Health, but certainly out on sites, and Dr. Kaizen got to this a little bit. You know, whether it's a foreign animal disease or any other emergency, not only human health, but you also need to take care of your staff as far as their mental health and well-being. That becomes paramount. Keeping a close eye on your staff members, you know, whether it's checking in as a group, maybe individuals, that's just beneficial in the long run. And then moving forward out of a foreign animal disease response and outbreak, that disease might change the way each site is run. So who's involved in day-to-day work, processes for the site, going back to that staff health piece. Keep your employees in the loop. Take in their thoughts and suggestions, and that may be beneficial moving forward to keep those good employees involved and caring about the work that they're doing with the animals long term. And I think involving them in those discussions to move out of that foreign animal disease outbreak and back into more normal, that is really beneficial to keep your employees apprised of everything and involved in those decision-making processes. And with that, everybody, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with all of you today. And Hallie, I will stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Dr. Thompson. We appreciate you joining us and sharing that information. So we are now at the point where we're going to start the Q&A, and I apologize because there is a full-on thunderstorm happening here in Washington, D.C. right now, so I hope there's not too much background noise going on and that I'm able to maintain my connection. I do want to mention just a couple things as we jump into the Q&A. First, the easiest place for me to see your question is if you enter it in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. I do see some people have put questions in the chat. I'll try to get back to them, but it's much harder to scroll in the chat to see your questions. So if you can add it to the Q&A block, that will help me immensely. Similarly, I see a few people have their hands raised. I've learned through the last 3 days of webinars that we can move much more quickly through if we just read the questions off. So again, if you're able to answer your Q&A into that block, that's going to be best if we get through all those questions, and I'll see if we've got time to go live to people, but we've had some IT challenges with that earlier in the week. One question that several folks had asked is, will we be providing continuing education credit for these webinars? These are informational. These are not for continuing education credits for veterinarians. So I did want to mention that, and I appreciate that question. Moving into our Q&A queue, we've got first question. Can you please talk about indemnity from the authorization of it, the variables in indemnity authority, the process for being eligible, what can disqualify someone? Dr. Shearer or Dr. Sifford, would one of you want to take that question? I know it's multi-part, so if I need to repeat anything, I can.
Hallie, I'll start, and then Dr. Sifford can add anything that I leave out. So indemnity is in the world is based on what the current value or what's determined as the current market value and fair market value of the animal. And there's different classes, of course, with different animals, and in this case there will be different classes with the swine in regards to where they're at in production status, or whether they're sows, gilts, weaned pigs, or butchers. So all those prices would be looked at based on their fair market value, and that would be fair market value in regards to replacement cost. The question that's currently that we always struggle with is, do we pay full fair market value, or what's the level going to be? The CFR says that the administrator may authorize the payment of full fair market value, but that's no guarantee. So we always make sure that people understand that we will approach the secretary for emergency funding, and he will approach Office of Management and Budget, of course, to get that money. And so that's where we'll determine what value, and based on the fair market value, what level we're able to pay. So that's part of it. So there's a couple of unknowns there. The question of what would eliminate or prevent a person from receiving indemnity, there's a couple things. If we see that there's or can determine that there's vast biosecurity breaches or an attempt to get the disease on purpose, which some people have done in the past, they would not be paid indemnity. If there's an example of someone that perhaps uses a method for euthanasia that's not condoned by or condoned or discussed with the state vet, the federal government, and themselves, that's not condoned by the AVMA, that may result in them not receiving indemnity. That's a possibility. It's not a given. So I don't know, Dr. Sifford, if you want to add anything.
And thank you, Dr. Shear. I would just add that, as I mentioned before, it's really important that we have an accurate inventory before any animals are moved or removed. And so, in the event that we are going to be paying indemnity, we'd be looking at that inventory to determine the indemnity to be paid. And that's why we try to work with you right away to get that put into place so that we can be sure we have all the animals that are on the facility. And then once we're removing animals, there aren't any questions about that. So just to reiterate that point, thank you, Dr. Shear.
That's a great point that I left out. Yeah, we need to know the inventory. It's important that that inventory be accurate. That inventory is important from the point of the indication that they have the disease because as pigs die and are removed, we may not be on the farm exactly on the day that that disease occurs, and there may be several pigs that are removed before we get there.
Thank you both. Next question, and I think this would be Dr. Shear, Dr. Sifford, for you both as well. How is ASF not a food safety concern?
Well, first of all, it's a virus that doesn't affect anything but pigs. So you can actually consume the meat. It won't hurt you in the least. So from that standpoint of affecting you or giving you the disease, it's not a food safety issue. It can become a food security issue, however, in the fact that many countries, and China's experiencing this, and I think the Dominican Republic may experience it too, as well as Haiti, that if your population depends on the pigs that are raised in your country and you're not a net importer and you contract this disease and pigs begin to die, then you need to look for another food source and have your folks convert over to that food source. So it can become a food security issue in that perhaps you can't raise enough pork to feed your population, and you could become a net importer, which is an expense, which many countries may not, depending on their position, may not be able to take on. So I don't know if Dr. Sifford wants to add anything.
No, sir. Thank you, though.
Great. Next question. During yesterday's session, which was focused on biosecurity, Dr. Oriana Beamer said that it can take 15 days for animals to show clinical signs of disease. Are pigs contagious during that time period? Dr. Shear, do you want to take that one too?
Yeah, they definitely are. What we've seen is probably 6 days, at about 6 days, they start to shed virus, and even though they're not showing clinical signs. And then as they begin to show clinical signs, they're definitely a full-blown part of the disease, and they're shedding the virus. So you can misdiagnose if you're going on visual signs of the disease only and loading pigs. You could misdiagnose that there's no problem and ship those pigs somewhere else. And that's our concern, is that this disease could spread without clinical signs of disease, where the pigs are still shedding the virus and being moved around the country for various aspects of production.
Thanks, Dr. Shear. We have a question about the 72-hour movement standstill and whether it would apply to products sent to rendering from a swine slaughter establishment. If a slaughter establishment still has hogs in the facility, are they better stopping operations and feeding the animals until the standstill is lifted? Dr. Shear.
I'll take a stab at it, but I'm not the expert on this. I would say if you've got pigs there and there's a stop movement, the best thing to do would be to process those hogs rather than have them stand there shedding virus and perhaps infecting other situations. The trace back will get to whether those pigs were infected and course, we can do testing of the site. Having them stand there with viruses is probably just as dangerous. And as far as the offal that would be processed or sent to the rendering plant, that movement would be the movement that would be stopped. Those products would be maintained until we could determine the status of the hogs that were processed that day. So we'd want to do the tracing to make sure, because those pigs that truly were part of a trace may have not been infected, and we could release the plant and the offal very, very soon after that.
Thanks, Dr. Shear. And I don't know if Dr. Thompson or Dr. Kaizen has anything to add there from a state perspective.
Yeah. Go ahead, sir.
I would just add that we would concur with what Dr. Shear said. It makes sense. The pigs are there. If they pass FSIS inspection and can be slaughtered, that's the best thing for those. And we would agree one of the goals for the standstill order is to figure out where disease is and where it's not. So don't be moving any products that could be a problem. So we would be in agreement.
And Hallie, it's a state call. I mean, we work, and that's what people need to understand. Federally, we don't put quarantines on places. We use the state's authority for quarantine or stop movement to work through. And this is a joint operation from the start to the finish between us, the state, and the industry. We have to cooperate and work together, or this won't work.
Thanks, Dr. Shear. Appreciate you mentioning that. Next question. Are there any regulatory requirements for biosecurity plans by USDA, OSHA, or other agencies? If yes, is there guidance available? Dr. Shear?
No regulatory requirements for biosecurity in the swine industry. Now that's different in the poultry industry, because our Office of Management and Budget has attached biosecurity standards, or the placement of those standards in relation to indemnity, so that we aren't allowed to pay indemnity for operations that don't have a biosecurity plan or in violation of that biosecurity plan, as seen by an audit process. We do not have that in the swine industry. I would say this, though, it's probably not far from coming, because Office of Management Budget is an interesting group in that they don't like to spend money on reinfection. And if they feel like biosecurity standards were breached, then they don't want to put the money forward to have that indemnity put in place. Now that does not, and I want to make sure people are clear, there's indemnity and then there's virus isolation. They're different. So you can be told you're not being paid indemnity because you have a biosecurity violation, but the U.S. government would pay for the cleaning and disinfection for virus isolation.
Thanks, Dr. Shear. Next question. Would animal movement from North American countries like Canada and Mexico be halted as part of the 72-hour standstill? Dr. Shear, Dr. Sifford?
I'll just put a simple yes on that.
Thank you.
I don't know if Dr. Sifford wants to add anything.
No, sir. Completely agree.
Great. Okay. This is a question about virus survival. So I'm not sure if our folks know the answer to this or not, but how long does the disease survive on objects such as clothes or shoes? How about skin or hair? If found on farms, would it be difficult to remove from soil or pins? So a multi-part question there. Dr. Shear, do you want to start?
This is kind of a hardy virus. Unless it comes in contact with disinfectants of different types, it survives quite well, especially at colder temperatures like what Minnesota would be dealing with in the winter in Iowa. So disinfection is extremely important. So it can survive 30 to 60 days easily on surfaces if it's cold and wet. There's a lot of data out there in the literature about the survival of this virus on different, like in feed and on different surfaces. In blood is a concern too. Like in that these pigs, when they're in the throes of the disease, they bleed out. They basically, blood can leak from they have bloody diarrhea. They have blood leaking from their nose or eyes. So that is full of virus. So cleanup is extremely important, and just cleaning and disinfection to remove virus. I don't know if other panels have, they might have different data on length of survival, but I'll just say this is a pretty hardy virus unless it's properly cleaned and unless proper disinfectants are used in cleaning. Thanks.
I'll give our other panelists an opportunity to chime in if you've got anything to add.
Nothing to add other than that's one of the biggest concerns with this virus is it's so hardy, survives a wide pH range, survives in meat for a long time. I mean, that's what makes some of the concerning pieces of how we would deal with this disease if it got to the United States.
Thanks, Dr. Kaizen. Dr. Scher, I think this next one is for you as well. Is the 72 hours a conservative incubation period for ASF signs to appear?
Well, no, it's really not. We're not using it for an incubation period. We're using it because we want to be able to at least do contact tracing from a known infected, and that's going to be the key. We're going to find a known infected site, and from that, we'll start doing contact tracing out from that site and into that site, so we know what came in that might have been infected and what went out that might have spread infection, or if the site was infected initially. Usually the first farm that you find is not the initial farm of infection, so you have to look. And we're hoping that, and 72 hours was just something that we put together in regards to what the industry said that they could probably sustain, a 72-hour standstill. It may have to go longer than that if we can't adequately feel like we've depleted the traces and done all the things that we needed to do to find the extent of the disease. Many people have talked, Dr. Kaizen pointed to how many pigs are moving around just in Iowa. So imagine across the nation, if that gets in the right system of movement, how much disease spread we could possibly be facing. So 72 hours is a target. It's not the end all, it's not the be all. It's just a target that we're shooting for based on when we've talked to the industry, what they felt they could sustain in holding their pigs back. And again, I think we saw during the processing plant standstill that the swine industry is very innovative and they find ways to get things done and to deal with the hardships. And this would be a hardship that we put upon them in regards to the disease. But not moving pigs and being safe is probably a good way to keep yourself from getting infected. And that means nothing's coming to you and nothing's going out from your farm. So you're basically, you have what you have. I hope that helps. I know that there's other people that have opinions on this. Dr. Kaizen, Dr. Thompson, Dr. Sifford.
I guess the only thing I would add, Dr. Scher, is that I think we all have to consider that hours and days on the front side of a disease outbreak and trying to figure out what's going on, our actions in that time frame could mean months, years, even decades on the backside of getting out from, removing the disease from the United States. If you look at Spain, and it took them, at least over 3 decades to eliminate it from Spain. So it's so absolutely critical that we do it right at the beginning, because we're not going to have a second chance.
I agree, Dr. Kaizen. One of the things that I think the Dominican Republic is struggling with right now is movement controls. I think they would like to do an eradication project and not end up destroying all their pigs. But one of the things that's coming back from some of the information we're receiving is that they don't feel like they have adequate movement controls, and that sick pigs are moving and infecting other pigs. So it's key and it's critical. Like Dr. Kaizen said, we got to get it up front. The faster we can determine where the infection is and begin to eliminate it and stop movement of those pigs. And this is a contact disease. Remember, it doesn't float through the air. It's not. It's contact traced, and it's a fomite driven. So people move it, vehicles move it, and equipment, as well as pigs. So the faster we can stop all that and find out where the disease is, and is cleanup. That's a cleanup period too that could be used to clean trucks and clean up facilities on the outskirts. We could get all that work done. So that's why we do it. That's what we're looking at.
Thanks,
Dr. Scheer, just to add on to that, Dr. Kaisend, to compare and contrast with avian influenza, those pictures I showed you of the birds being sick, that happens fast. It happens very fast. And African swine fever, we aren't going to have that clinical picture possibly with hogs that might be moving, and especially early in the outbreak. So to your point, to Dr. Kaisend's point, yes, we need to get in front of it as soon as possible and put those controls into place, because we won't have the benefit of knowing that hogs are dying and they have the disease. Over.
Thanks, Dr. Thompson. Appreciate you mentioning that. We have had a couple questions about recordings being available. And if you didn't hear it at the beginning, I did want to mention we do have a web page where we are putting the recordings from the webinars for all 5 days. If you Google ASF Action Week, that link will appear and you'll be able to register for tomorrow's webinar and also see the recordings for the first 3 days. There's also a link in the chat, but that may be harder to see at this point. Next question. How long will a site be required to be down prior to restocking? Is it about time down or more about the site being cleaned and disinfected? Dr. Scheer, do you want to start?
I'll start, and then some of the other experts can talk. Downtime, first of all, you got to get the pigs eliminated, depopulated. Then you have to figure out how you're going to dispose of them. And the disposal methods are vast and different depending on the farm and the method that's being chosen. After that is done and it's determined that there's no infectious agent still on the farm, then we go to cleaning and disinfection or virus elimination. Once that is done, you would assume that a person could restock, but if there is infection currently around their farm, and those farms are not cleaned up and at the same level, then restocking would not occur. Now that timeline can vary based on how quickly different production facilities move and how fast they clean and disinfect. Remember that if you're infected and your neighbors are infected, everybody are in the process of fighting for the same resources to get that cleaning and disinfection done. So that at times slows the ability to get there, but we would not want repopulation or restocking to occur until we were absolutely sure that the virus was gone and there would be no chance of reinfection. And that could be a few months, easily, to a year.
Thanks, Dr.
I'm gonna ask if anyone else has anything to say. Thanks, Hallie.
Dr. Kaisend, Dr. Thompson, anything from the state perspective?
I guess the only thing I would add is that also, one of the other factors that where we at in a disease outbreak is the disease widespread. Is there very few sites infected? So, all the points Dr. Scheer mentioned, I would agree with, and just where we at in a disease outbreak, what's the current situation, and just determining the safety of whether it's safe to restock or not.
Thanks. Dr. Sifford, this next question is about your presentation. In your talk, you mentioned that should an ASF case be suspected during a 72-hour standstill of swine movement will occur. Any pigs in transit will be delivered to their destination. Is this correct? What is the reason to continue to the destination versus going back to the original location? It seems that introducing pigs to new locations could be risky and spread disease.
Thank you, Hallie. And that is a good question. Really what it comes down to is once the pigs have been loaded out from the facility, a couple of things can happen. One, in some cases, depending on where the pigs are moving from, there might not be a suitable place to turn them around and send them back there. In a lot of cases, the throughput for some facilities is very tight, and as soon as they're loaded on the truck, their space is taken by other animals. Additionally, once they're loaded on the truck and move away from this facility, they become a biosecurity risk for wherever they go. And so in the end, it was determined that the most appropriate was to have them continue to move to their destination where there was already a plan in place for them to be there. And then, of course, doing the trace outs would allow us to make a determination if there, was a disease event associated with that we would need to take action for. If others would like to add, I'd be happy to have them do that. Thank you.
Thanks. Anything to add before we move to the next question? Okay, I think we're good then. Next question, how long do we anticipate a trace taking on these pigs? What is the primary method of tracing? Will we mainly use certificates of veterinary inspection, or do we have any way to access real-time data? Do we foresee industry moving to a platform that would allow for real-time tracing of pigs? So multiple questions in that, and I'm happy to repeat it if needed. Dr. Scheer, do you want to take the first stab at it?
Sorry, Hallie, I couldn't hear all that. Can you run that by me one more time?
Yes. How long do we anticipate a trace taking on these pigs? What is the primary method of tracing? Will we mainly use certificates of veterinary inspection, or do we have any way to access real-time data? Lastly, do we foresee industry moving to a platform that would allow for real-time tracing of the pigs?
Whoever wrote this question is hitting on a real important point, and that's the ability to access data and to do it quickly. There will be state records and CVIs that will be used as far as what movements occurred, which will help us get into herds and know and do some of that tracing. But to have this movement data already captured and verified or updated in a data system is extremely important. We're working on some of that with the states now. Iowa's working with us on getting some of this information into EMERS, our Emergency Management Response System, which is a database. There are other databases that are out there. The National Pork Board has developed AgView, and they're collecting information. It's voluntary information that the producer would put in. We could access that if it's available, and if we can get to it, and if the producer allows us to do that on a voluntary basis. So those systems are extremely important, and that data is extremely important. It's not that we want to know a person's everyday business. We just want to know where the pigs are and what pigs might have come to certain locations that might have or be harboring the infection, so that we can do that quickly, go out, look at the pigs, put a quarantine on based on what we would call exposure. So then just test and wait to see if they become infected, or if they pass the test, then of course then we open up movement. But that data, that information that is out there, that every farm, every producer knows what's happened on their farm, that's extremely important. And then the data that the states will have and have garnered through movements, through CVIs, will also be utilized. I can't say enough about that. I mean, that's extremely important, and that will assist us in the tracing for a 72-hour movement. The more information we have, the more accurate that information is, the faster we can move in regards to finding where the disease is and where the disease isn't. I'll stop there and see if anyone else wants to say anything.
The other part of that question is, how long do we anticipate a trace taking?
Well, that'll vary, because I think with CVI records, we have them right there on location. If the information is in a database, we can look that up very quickly. It's all automated. But there's another method too, where you go out and you interview. It's a farm interview, and you find out what movements have occurred. That's the slowest method. That's going to take the most time. That requires an individual on a state or federal side to go out and speak with a producer and collect that information. A lot of businesses, farm production, and this industry is heavily integrated. We can obtain some of that information from these large swine operations that are part of a business operation. So I would say it can take minutes to days, depending on what type of process we're using.
Thanks, Dr. Scheer. If anyone has anything, any of our other panelists have anything to add, please feel free.
You know, I would add from a Minnesota perspective, and not always swine, but occasionally when our field staff has some extra time, we might pull a random tag number or a random lot and just see how quickly we can move through that process. I'm wondering if farmers can do that too, you know, either from one site or maybe one lot that is moved on to a packer. Always good to get a little experience under your belt before something happens.
So sort of add what Dr. Thompson said, I mean, and the answer, partly we'll take records anywhere, but we need to work on it ahead of time. So that's all coordinated. So when the disease outbreak happens, we can quickly move through that EIP information and figure out what's going on, and that's going to dictate what the next steps are in the outbreak. You know, if some of that initial work finds it's only a very few sites, or it appears it's only a very few sites, and we have a shot at stamping out and eradicating, that's how we need to move forward. If we find out there's a lot of sites infected, you know, that may dictate the next steps in the course of the outbreak. And there could easily be a scenario where we're stamping out and eradicating one day, and the next day we move to not stamping out, eradicating, and dealing in the disease in different ways. And that's going to be an important aspect for certain producers, that the more we can do now and tie things together is going to be so critical during the disease outbreak.
Thanks, Dr. Kaizen. Next question. Explain how and who would be testing pigs for African swine fever. How long does it take to get a positive test result? Dr. Scheer?
That's a good question. One of the things that Iowa State University is working on, Dr. Pam Zabel and others, is a process where a certification training for certified sample takers, because we know that there aren't enough swine veterinarians in the world to sample the number of pigs that would need to be sampled, and to get to all the locations that need to be sampled if this disease should occur. So those certified trainers will become very important, and that training process will be very important. It'll train them on what samples to take, how to take those samples, how to package those samples, and it will certify them. So that's a process that's being worked on, and is part of the Farm Bill. That project was funded by USDA, and it's a great project. And I'll just say that that's very important. The other piece is veterinarians will be taking those samples too, submitting them to the labs. We have 47 National Animal Health Laboratory Network labs that can run these ASF samples. And we have, I can't remember the capacity, I think it's around 245,000 samples that could be run in a pooled aspect if you pool 5 samples together from the same location in a day. So that's a lot of samples. We still want to improve that number and raise that number. Those samples that are positive, are suspect positive, would be sent to FADL, or the Foreign Animal Disease Laboratory in Plum Island, and they would be confirmed there or not confirmed there. So the final confirmation always goes to the Foreign Animal Disease Diagnostic Lab. So that can take that the initial samples can be run, the PCR can be run at the Nuln lab within a day, within hours. I'd say it takes about 4 to 6 hours. Then those samples can be packaged and sent on. So a maximum of 2 to 3 days, and we'll have either a positive diagnosis or a negative. I think that's correct, and I want to rely on Dr. Sifford to back me up on my numbers, because I'm a little hazy on that.
I think you hit it. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, we've just got a couple minutes left, but I want to try to see if we can quickly tackle a couple more questions. Will live haul trucks be cleaned, disinfected, and inspected before leaving processing plants? Dr. Scheer?
You know, we have a slaughter plant working group, and they're working on that. We've been talking. We've got business and farm representatives for the live haul trucks. One of the gaps that we've identified, and it's a serious gap, is truck washes. We just don't have enough, and they just don't exist. So that's what we put this group together to identify where the gaps are and things we need to fix. So that's a problem that is in the offing, and we've really got to look at. There are some available. Some parts of the industry do have their own truck washes, and there are, of course, local truck washes available in certain sites across from, say, slaughter plants and things like that. But we don't have enough, and it's not enough to deal with the issue of the trucks that are on the road. So that's something we have to address, and the industry's, I think, is well aware of that and where we need to go with that.
Thanks, Dr. Scheer. Okay, I'm going to try to squeeze in one more here, and it's not an easy one, but how is USDA planning to dispose of hog carcasses if African swine fever hits the United States?
I'll start and then I'll let others talk. There's various methods we tried with, and as we know, some work better than others. There's burial. Some states can't bury because of their water line, or where the water level is in their state. There's shallow pit composting. There's composting in general. There's incineration. We're looking at different ways of composting, such as grinding in a site that wouldn't allow contamination and composting from there. There are other methods that have been talked about in different states. States have looked at utilizing these carcasses to provide energy in an energy plant type of combustion system, which I don't really understand, but I think there are all kinds of methods that are out there. Some work better than others. We just have to explore the best ones based on the facility that we're working off of. Taking everything to a landfill is probably not going to be an option, and we have to look at other methods to deal with this.
Thanks, Dr. Scheer. Does anyone want to add anything else before we wrap up?
Hallie, I'd just like to quickly add to Dr. Scheer's comments that in many of the planning activities that we have conducted with partners in states around the country, we've been careful to include their environmental regulators to make sure that whatever disposal methods we use are appropriate for the local environment. As Dr. Scheer mentioned, there's lots of factors that go into that we have in our planning exercises have routinely included those folks as well. Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Hallie, I left out rendering, and that is, to me, is a critical component that we need to incorporate but we have to help the rendering folks in socializing that once this product's rendered, it's safe, and there's no contaminant, there's nothing coming out of that plant. It's a sterile product, but the people that take their product don't like the idea of them processing a diseased carcass. So we have some socialization and some training to do in that aspect to help the renderers help us. Okay.
Appreciate you mentioning that. And we are at 3:30, so I do want to go ahead and close things out. Before I turn things back over to Dr. Scheer for just final comments, I want to mention that I tried to get to as many questions as I could. I did see several on feral swine. Tomorrow is Feral Swine Friday as part of African Swine Fever Action Week. So if you come back and join us at tomorrow's webinar at 2 p.m. Eastern, we will answer your feral swine questions. Dr. Scheer, over to you.
Thanks, Hallie. I'll just close out by saying I hope people are benefiting from this. I really appreciate our speakers and the level of engagement they've given us and the product that they've given us. It's been a great product, and we've had a lot of comments on the expertise of our speakers. So I will just say this: thank you for attending. Look forward to tomorrow and letting you know what we know and what we're talking about in regards to feral swine. Thanks, Hallie, very much.
Thank you, everyone, for participating. This concludes our webinar, and we hope you have a good rest of the day.
Recording stopped.